We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're tuned in to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
And Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
This is the 85th episode of Evidence of Design. It's Saturday, February 29th. Whether you're tuned in on 100.9 FM in Rochester at www.1009wxir.com or on the TuneIn app, we welcome you here. Today's a very special show. We're joined with a guest in the studio. Joining us is Dr. Shawgi Tell, professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College, where he's been teaching for 21 years. Dr. Tell's research interests include education policy and reform, the political economy of schooling, charter schools, and neoliberalism. He is a frequent contributor to the online newsletter Dissident Voice and an author of the 2016 book Charter School Report Card. Dr. Tell, welcome to Evidence of Design.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. We're going to have a great discussion this hour on the effects of market-based reforms on public education. We've, of course, talked about education a number of times on the show in the past. A full disclosure, I work for the RCSD, and we've talked about education in many ways in the past. And so we also want to hear what your thoughts are as we talk about the effects of market-based reforms on public education. You can get in touch with us a number of different ways. First and foremost, this is live radio, so give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. You can also email us at radioeod@gmail.com, and we're on Facebook and Twitter at Radio EOD. EOD, of course, standing for Evidence of Design. Let's wait no longer and get right into it. Dr. Tell, I'm not sure how closely you've been following the election cycle that we're in right now, but of course we're in the midst of a very important election season. What are the candidates saying about education, if anything?
Yeah. That's a good question, and I think one of the things that really struck me and caught my attention this time around about this election is if you look at previous elections, everybody sort of talks about education in a general way, and they talk about increasing funding for schools and increasing salaries for teachers and, expanding kindergarten and that sort of thing. And some people talk about school choice in various ways. But what's interesting about this presidential election on the Democratic side is that nearly every Democratic candidate, and I think we've gone from 21 down to 6 or 7 now, but nearly every Democratic candidate has either come out opposing charter schools or close to opposing charter schools or saying something critical and negative about charter schools. And that in a way it has become unfashionable to say something positive about charter schools, and I attribute that to the growing social consciousness in society about the many serious problems plaguing charter schools. In other words, more and more people are more and more aware of the problems with charter schools, and people are not passive about it, and I think the Democratic candidates feel the need to reflect that. And so Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are probably the two most obvious examples of individuals coming out. I don't know how to say this, but I guess the strongest opponents of charter schools, and they've put forward different visions and plans for opposing charter schools. And then the other folks have said things critical of charter schools. And then Senator Cory Booker tried to ride the fence for a long time there and finally bailed out. I think the only individual right now who's sort of openly supporting charter schools is billionaire Michael Bloomberg. And but otherwise, everyone else is offering something of a critical view of charter schools and school privatization, and at the same time propping up public education. And within that, I've heard different candidates say that they want to eliminate student debt, which is incredibly high and unsustainable in my view. I think around $1.4 trillion. And others are proposing to, triple Title I funding and that sort of thing. So it is uplifting, it is positive to hear candidates come out and oppose school privatization and charter schools, because it opens the space more for that discussion. And that's a good thing in my view.
So you spoke a lot about the views on education coming from the left on the Democratic side. Are we staying in touch with what's happening on the right too, and the policies of perhaps Trump or his administration?
Yeah, this has been interesting because just like No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act, high stakes testing, these school privatization schemes have always been a bipartisan policy. And so you've always had lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans support these antisocial neoliberal schemes. So the idea that it's mainly a right-wing phenomenon or a conservative phenomenon or a Republican phenomenon is not quite accurate, because Democrats, many of them at least, have been on board at the federal and state and local level, but that's changing. Now, as far as Republicans go, there's no shortage of Republicans who still support some form of school privatization, but in a recent interesting twist, and everyone seems to be talking about this, and the impression is being created that charter school advocates are quite livid about this. I'm still not sure how to interpret this, but the biggest thing coming up right now is that President Trump and billionaire U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos are thinking of eliminating the federal charter schools funding program that started in 1994. And so far it's transferred nearly $4 billion to the private sector for seed money for charter schools, and it's been around a long time. Around now, I think it's funded to the tune of $440 million a year. And so the proposal coming from DeVos and Trump is that they want to collapse this program into one big state block grant for a total of $19.4 billion that will be given to the states to do with as they wish in the name of removing the federal footprint from, states' rights. And this has a lot of charter school folks really, really anxious and really, really worried. I'm not sure why they're doing this exactly. Some arguments have been that they want to shift their attention to vouchers and, what do they call them? Tax credit opportunity scholarships. It's just a fancy name for transferring public funds to the private sector. And so I think they had proposed putting aside $5 billion to fund these voucher schemes, and that they are sort of backpedaling away from prioritizing charter schools. So if it does go through that this federal charter schools program that's been around since 1994 is folded into a state block grant type of scheme, it will be harder for charter school owners and operators to get their hands on that money, because different states may use that money for different purposes. Now, DeVos seems to be saying that certain governors have told her that they will continue to use the money for expanding charter schools, and that we will supposedly see, and I quote, a dramatic expansion of charter schools. So it's a little bit hazy. It's a little bit hard to tell how things are exactly going to unfold and where the chips are going to land. But that's sort of the latest interesting controversial twist in the government side of things and the Republican side of things.
Oh, that's interesting. I know that the federal charter schools program has been under recent scrutiny by organizations like the Network for Public Education. They have a report recently released called Still Asleep at the Wheel, How the Federal Charter Schools Program Creates a Pileup of Fraud and Waste, documenting essentially this program since the 90s that you mentioned is federal dollars are not going to charter schools in sort of the most efficient manner, and they're poorly performing in a number of ways. But we also know that Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is a big proponent of vouchers in her home state before she was appointed to her current position. That's really interesting. about how maybe they're going to be backing away from charter schools in many ways.
Yeah, so some interesting dynamics. It's hard to, at this stage for me at least, to interpret the shifts in governance that are taking place and how real this is, and are charter school owners and operators going to, as always, invent new schemes and plot new schemes to get their hands on public money? One of the things I always tell people is that neoliberals and privatizers never stop scheming to loot the public purse. And so they may suffer defeats here and there, and they may suffer losses here and there, but they are relentless in their efforts to seize as much public funds as possible. And not just public funds, but public facilities worth millions and millions of dollars. So they don't take defeat lightly. They are always getting right back up and scheming and plotting new ways to undermine the public interest.
Let's define some of these terms, neoliberals, public and private. Maybe we can start with public, and I feel like we take the notion of the word public for granted, and we kind of throw it around public education. Can you give us a sense of what public means in the sense of public education and why that word public is so important?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because one of the things the neoliberals and privatizers have done, and they're always very opposed to analysis and investigation, but one of the things they've done is blur the distinction between public and private. And if you actually look up the words public and private in the dictionary, they are actually antonyms. They mean the exact opposite of each other. And, intuitively you may know that, but they actually mean the opposite of each other. So just let's keep it simple. Public means for the common good, for everyone, for all. It is inclusive. It is not exclusive. It does not involve rivalry or competition. And so public services and public programs are supposed to be either free or very affordable. They're inclusive, they're for everyone. Private, on the other hand, means exclusive, not for everyone, for me, myself, and I. And that's okay. You can have a public sphere and you can have a private sphere, but we get into trouble when you confound the two terms and treat them as if they were similar, which is what public-private partnerships do, to create the impression that it's a win-win for both sides when really it's not. So public and private mean the opposite of each other. It's important to also appreciate the historical rise of the public sphere and the public interest over the course of several centuries and coming out of the period of the Enlightenment. That prior to that period, you really didn't have a public sphere. You didn't have freedom of speech. You didn't have investigation and inquiry and public discussion and subjecting everything to scrutiny. And, fast forward, here we are, and we all realize that the public sphere is integral to a vibrant democracy, that you have to actually hash things out and talk about things and be extremely transparent and be very open and let the best argument win. And authority is derived from the best argument, not from God, King, President, or Xerox. So it comes from argument. Who has the best argument? But once you privatize the public sphere or the public interest, that's when you run into all kinds of problems that are harmful to the public interest and to the body politic writ large. And so charter schools, for example, are not transparent and they're not very accountable. They will always claim they are, but they're not open to public scrutiny. And there are many court cases actually dealing with this non-transparency and inadequate accountability. So always keep the difference between public and private in mind, and just appreciate that something is not public just because someone calls it public 50 times a day. So to make the claim that charter schools are public is very problematic, because in so many ways they are not public and they do not possess the features of public schools, properly speaking.
Even if a charter school is a non-for-profit charter school, it's still not public, right?
That's right. It's still a corporation. So you have, it's funny, you have this public sphere, private sphere, what do they call it? The public sector, the private sector, and sort of this third sector. And the third sector is this area where the non-profits and the for-profits fall in. Public schools as we know them, and there are 100,000 public schools in 15,000 school districts, but public schools as we know them are actually government agencies, and more technically, they are political subdivisions of the state. Charter schools are not. So they're not public properly speaking. They may receive tons of public money, but just receiving public money doesn't automatically make you public, nor does being tuition free, at least ostensibly, make you public. And just to say that, well, we are open to all students, therefore we are public, is also disingenuous, because it's well established that charter schools do cherry pick their students, whereas public schools accepts all students at all times for free.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of charter schools and how they came to be in the United States?
Sure. So you can actually go back to the mid to late 1970s to see some of the embryonic stages of the charter school idea. But keep in mind that the neoliberal agenda and practice really was launched in the late 1970s, early 1980s, especially with Reagan in the U.S. in 1980 and Thatcher in England. Let's look at this timeline. So 1980s, late 70s, neoliberal practice and agenda is introduced. 1983, the infamous A Nation at Risk report comes out. And that sets the tone for the neoliberal restructuring of education for the next 45, 50 years. So 1980, 1983, then 1988, an obscure New England educator by the name of Ray Budd produces what is actually the nation's first 100-page blueprint for charter schools in the United States. And most people have actually not read what I would characterize as an incredibly important piece of work in the charter school evolution, and that's Ray Budd's pamphlet on charter schools. The title actually escapes me right now. And so 1988, Ray Budd puts forward this blueprint, and he circulates it broadly among leaders and influential people and shakers and movers to see if he can get any traction for it. And so, again, let's look at the timeline. A few short years later, 1991 in Minnesota, the nation's first charter school law is passed, and Minnesota actually establishes its first charter school the following year in 1992, which is the same year that California, now with the most charter schools in the United States at 1,300, give or take, establishes its own charter school law. And it really isn't much time at all after that you see one state after another pass charter school legislation. And everybody knows to be able to pull off something that big, that fast, requires enormous power. And so charter schools have their beginnings in the late 80s, early 1990s. So they've been around 28 years, give or take. We have about 3.1, 3.2 million kids enrolled in about 7,100 charter schools around the country. 44 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam have laws enabling charter schools creation and expansion. And I will say about, this is tricky, maybe around 300 to 400 charter schools are started every year, but 150 to 200 close every year. Yeah. And by my estimates, over the last 28 years, a little more than 3,000 charter schools have closed for poor performance and financial malfeasance. So we are going to see charter schools keep expanding. I don't see them slowing down anytime soon, and I do think it is getting harder and harder for charter school owners and operators and promoters to justify their existence, and I think you're going to see increased resistance to them, really in all sectors.
Well, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking with Dr. Shawgi Tell, professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College, and we're having a discussion this hour on the effects of market-based reforms on public education. As a reminder, you can let us know what you think throughout this discussion by giving us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. We can also be found through email, through Gmail or Facebook and Twitter at Radio EOD. Dr. Tell, I want to jump off a point that you just mentioned where charter school, new charter schools open every year, charter schools close every year. There's this word in sort of critical theory of capitalism called creative destruction, or the idea that capitalism kind of and free market and competition promotes things starting and ending, right? Let the best person remain standing in the end. That's probably not the best thing that we want in our educational system, right? We probably don't want schools to open and close. Do you have anything to say on that regard?
Yeah, I think it was Joseph Schumpeter who came up with that expression, creative destruction. I think it's just a sanitized way of referring to the chaos, anarchy, and violence of the so-called free market is what it really is. And so when you take a social responsibility like education, healthcare, welfare, roads, railroads, air travel, and privatize it and turn it into a commodity and subject it to the chaos and anarchy and violence of the so-called free market, then you run into all kinds of problems. Things do open and close regularly. And in fact, charter school advocates, charter school owners and operators are very comfortable with free market ideology. They do think everything should be run on the basis of the free market. And obviously they think that this is the best of all worlds and the law of the jungle is how you get the best stuff. But they will even go so far as to say that when a charter school is failing, that it should not only be closed, but it should be closed ruthlessly. Not clear to me why it has to be ruthless, but it should be closed ruthlessly. But it makes sense from the perspective of free market logic, because it's like going to the mall, shoe store goes out of business, and hey, let's shut it down and let's let the next smart entrepreneur come in and give it a shot. And this is the attitude that's taken with these schools, as if education is no longer a social responsibility, but just a business or a commodity. And that's just not how things work. And I think actually this is actually undermining charter schools themselves, because now they have to compete with each other. They have to compete with each other for funding. They have to compete with each other for students. And they've sort of brought this mess onto themselves as well. And so the free market is a recipe for instability. And you can even see with the latest stock market decline that you can't base human needs on the free market. If you want the free market, that's fine. But if you want to meet people's basic needs, the free market is not going to get that done.
I was wondering, what are some of the arguments in favor of charter schools? As I guess we're painting them to be not a great situation, and I think probably most of us think so. But what are some of the arguments that make them keep going? Right.
So there's quite a few arguments. One of the main arguments is that public schools are failing, public schools are lousy, public schools are monopolies, public schools are behemoth bureaucracies, public schools are just bad, bad, bad. And given that, then you should want to take your child out of that bad school, that failing school, which we're not supposed to analyze why it's failing. We're just supposed to blindly assume it's failing. And then you send your child to a charter school that you heard about through maybe some glossy literature you got in the mail, or someone came canvassing to your house, or you heard it through the grapevine. So that argument, if it can be called an argument, has been used regularly, that you don't want your kids stuck in a failing public school. Why don't you send them to a charter school where everything will be better? The irony there is that the performance of charter schools is persistently poor, and the test scores, if you even want to consider that a useful criteria, is regularly quite weak. And that's why when you hear charter school owners say our students are doing great, or our students are going to college, really the first question to ask there is, who are your students? Because if you can cherry pick your students, sure, you can be successful. Now, the other reason given for why charter schools should exist is going back to this consumerist notion of choice. Mm-hmm. And that we Americans love choice. We like to be able to choose between Cocoa Krispies versus Frosted Flakes. It should be Snickers versus Mars bars, and that's all cool, that's fine. But that choice trumps everything, that choice is more important than rights, and that this is how we empower parents, and that education is first and foremost a parental responsibility, and that charter schools empower parents and put parents center stage. The irony there is that it's not the parents and the students that choose the charter schools, actually the other way around. So those are the two most common arguments that, again, public schools are failing, but we're not supposed to analyze why. And by the way, they're failing because the neoliberal state that supports charter schools is the same neoliberal state that has mandated the failure of public schools by testing, punishing, and privatizing, by starving and punishing and privatizing. And then the other one, again, is choice. And choice is a funny word because who could be against choice? So there's choice in the abstract, which means here's a list of alternatives that you can select from, and that's fine, versus the free market consumerist notion of choice. So when charter school folks talk about choice in the free market, what they're really doing implicitly is relying on the ideology of individualism and consumerism and the free market. But again, I would argue, and many have argued, that education is not a commodity. It is not a business. It's a social responsibility. It's a right, and that government should take up its social responsibility to provide that right with a guarantee in practice. And if they did that, parents would not have to deal with shopping for schools that actually choose them.
We've talked a lot already about things that could be manifestations of neoliberal ideology. We've invoked the term neoliberalism a few times already. That word neoliberalism is in the description of our show, Evidence of Design. Would you mind helping us understand what neoliberalism is, what it means to you, Dr. Tell, and why that term is so important, but not used often in the public sphere? I'm guessing most listeners right now haven't heard of the word neoliberalism.
All right. So there's many ways to approach this. Let's just break it down. Neo means new, or once again, or another form of. Okay. Liberalism in this case refers to the laissez-faire economic doctrine of capitalism. So neoliberalism means a new form of the free market, a new form of capitalism. And so, again, that emerged in the late 70s, early 80s. And neoliberalism, there's a big consensus out there that it was a response to the falling rate of profit that capitalist firms were experiencing, especially between 1965 and onward. The so-called golden age of capitalism was 1945 to 1968, give or take, and that's when all boats were supposedly rising, and even though inequality was still very high. But come the 1970s, early 1980s, the rate of profit and the amount of profit within the economy was falling and declining. And so if you're a business whose main goal is to maximize profit as fast as possible, no matter the cost to society and the environment, then you're going to look for ways to do that. And what neoliberalism really meant in practice was cutting back, restricting, and eliminating all kinds of social programs that humanity had fought for. And it also meant reducing, restricting, and cutting workers' wages and salaries and benefits and pensions, increasing mergers and acquisitions, segmenting production around the world, and consolidating the political and economic power of monopolies nationally and internationally to reverse the declining rate of profit. And so this is why everything from railroads to regular roads to garbage collection to healthcare to welfare, so many things are actually being privatized, which is basically handing over public money, public facilities, public programs, public enterprises to the rich so that they can stay afloat and stay competitive and not be gobbled up by their competition. So neoliberalism is a ramped up version of, good old-fashioned capitalism. It wasn't like there was the past was somehow sunshine and butterflies and now it's terrible, but it is a very intensified version capitalism. And that's why everyone talks about the dramatic increase in income inequality, wealth inequality, and political inequality. It's also the reason why more and more people see the political setup as having less legitimacy.
Well, if you're just if you're just joining us, you're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're going to take a short break, and we'd encourage everyone to give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. We're talking with Dr. Shawgi Tell, professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College, and we're talking about the effects of market-based reforms on public education. We'll be right back. Hang on.
Ball of Confusion as covered by Love and Rockets.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking with Dr. Shawgi Tell, professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College, and we're talking about the effects of market-based reforms on public education. As a reminder, you can get in touch with us at Radio EOD. That's through Facebook, Twitter, or Gmail, or you can give us a call at 585-219-8889. We are live for you on Saturday, February 29th. That happens to be a leap day. Congratulations, everyone.
Oh, that's right.
It also happens to be the day of the South Carolina primary. Congratulations, everyone. So let's continue on with our discussion on market-based reforms in education and perhaps their negative effects. Dr. Tell, before the break, you just gave us sort of a definition, a little bit of a history about the word neoliberalism, why that's important, why so many of the things that we're talking about this hour, like so-called failing public schools, like the charter schools movement, like efforts to privatize public goods and services, are sort of manifestations of neoliberal ideology. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I think, this agenda is wreaking havoc nationally and internationally. I think you're seeing more and more countries privatize their services and open their countries up to foreign direct investment. And all those sorts of developments end up undermining the public sphere, democracy, workers' rights, and people's livelihoods. And so we really are in a globalized situation. And I get the big powers in the main core capitalist countries in U.S., Europe, and Japan still pretty much dominate the globe, even with these rising emerging economies. They pretty much dominate the globe. But I think what's exciting is you are seeing different movements at home and abroad against these phony austerity budgets and phony austerity programs. And, people are trying to say in one way or another, enough is enough, and that people's rights to food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, and work, and retirement and dignity really need to be put center stage. And we just can't keep going on like this. When you have the Federal Reserve, and someone can verify this, printing $60 billion phantom dollars a month just to artificially prop the economy, and Europe doing the same, and Japan doing the same, and China doing the same. Really what it tells you is that the economies of the world are a basket case. They're running on gas fumes, and here we are 10, 12 years later, and none of the countries have really, truly come out of the Great Recession that's turned into the Long Depression now. And so I think in this context where the so-called leaders of the world have really no solutions, it becomes a very dangerous situation for everyone. And this is all the more reason it's important for people from all walks of life, workers, women, students, youth, to really unite and figure out how to move forward in the complicated here and now. And it is hard to figure out how to move forward. But it's a dangerous time. It's also an exciting time, and you are seeing openings and cracks, and I think this radio station is a really, really good example of this. Years ago, you couldn't even imagine young people coming together and putting these topics on the agenda to talk about publicly and vocally. I think the broader this discussion can be taken, the better. And these platforms, these different social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook can also be used, yes, they're frequently used for not good purposes, but can also be used in very positive ways.
We're talking about the big picture right now, but perhaps we should zoom in a little bit. I want to remind listeners that I work for the RCSD as disclosure, so I'm going to speak about the RCSD sort of phenomenologically here, not specifically. So let's zoom in and talk about some of the local crises in education. In 2018, Dr. Tell, I believe you wrote a letter to the Rochester City School District's Board of Education in response to the Distinguished Educator Report.
That's right.
That was authored by the then-appointed Distinguished Educator, Jaime Aquino. You were, I think, largely critical of that report for a number of reasons that you're welcome to expand on. And specifically, I just want to quote briefly that you wrote that reforming schools without reforming society is profoundly counterproductive. And you went on to say that urban schools do not operate outside of a decaying society that privileges a tiny elite. Do you want to expand upon sort of what you meant in that?
Yeah. So for, let's see, 12 to 16 months, last 12 to 16 months, the shakers and movers in Rochester, the mayor of Rochester, certain state legislators who represent the Rochester area, wealthy interests locally, former mayors, basically the shakers and movers in the community, resurrected this idea of a takeover of the Rochester City School District, which, as you know, is the poorest district in the state of New York. And it took different forms. One day it was mayoral takeover, one day it was state takeover. And historically, takeovers of public schools not only mean the elimination of elected governance, which we value in America, but it means handing over control of massive public enterprises to the rich and their representatives. In the name of fixing things, in the name of improving things, or in the name of serving the kids, or in the name of raising achievement, all these lofty things. But what the evidence shows and experience confirms repeatedly is that city takeovers, mayoral takeovers, state takeovers make everything much worse. But if you play on people's fears and bad experiences that they may have had in a school district, then you can confuse them and get them to go along with something that is actually very harmful to their interests. Now, I'm happy to say that due to community activism here in Rochester, which has a long tradition of community activism, we were able to stop the takeover of the Rochester City School District. But as I said earlier, neoliberals and privatizers do not rest. They do not stop. And so the latest incarnation of a takeover of the district is this idea that we will give the district $35 million, which is way less than what the state actually owes the city school district, if they submit to and obey the appointment of quote unquote a monitor. And of course, it's not clear what this monitor would do, but my gut tells me it would be an individual who basically usurps the authority of the elected school board and basically acts as a representative of Wall Street to privatize and charterize and rip up teacher contracts and collective bargaining agreements and all the negative things we've seen in these kinds of arrangements. And so part of the problem here too is that just targeting the school, even though everyone knows poverty is a problem and segregation is a problem and underfunding and overtesting are problems, will somehow turn things around. But schools exist in society. They don't exist outside society. They reflect what goes on in society. And if you do nothing to solve poverty or inequality or all the other social ills affecting people, then you're not really going to have a big impact on education. So treating education abstractly and in an isolated way is a good way to fool the gullible. I think it's been very positive that we've seen teachers and their supporters and their allies in recent weeks and months come out and demonstrate and rally and protest against the layoffs, against the cuts, and all these sorts of things. And I think the more resistance, more collective, organized resistance there is regarding that, the harder it will be for the rich and their state to take over the district in the name of improving it, but really not improving it. So we've seen state takeovers all over the place. And I'm going to be blunt, they're just horrible. They're just horrible. And jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire is not going to be helpful. And what we really should be doing, or one of the many things we should be doing, is demanding that the schools be fully funded. And just to throw around numbers like, well, the per pupil spending in the district is this much and it's much less in neighboring schools, why are they doing better, is a very disingenuous and lazy way of approaching the topic, because averages or average per pupil funding rates tell us something, but they don't tell us that much. So looking at the evolution and the history and the nature and the dynamics of a school district in its relationship to society and its relationship to the whole is very important. And this is why neoliberals don't like analysis, they don't like investigation, they don't like deep inquiry. And so I think Jaime Aquino, who has connections with neoliberals, I'd like to repeat that, Jaime Aquino, who has connections with neoliberals, was deliberately and consciously brought in to do this report, which I've told people in the community, I've always felt the report was a hatchet job, and not to take it seriously, because right from the get-go you could tell that it was a setup. And I think the Democrat and Chronicle has always also played a very negative role in this regard, just basically trying to impose this anti-social, anti-public view on the public that we must have a state takeover because it's quote unquote about the kids, and the analysis ends there. So there's supposed to be no analysis. Again, so spaces like this is where we can develop that analysis and develop that discussion and deepen that thinking so that people are thinking through the issues in a good way so that we can develop real solutions instead of these bigger disasters.
You've invoked the term antisocial a number of times now. Could you talk about what you mean by it?
So it's antisocial, meaning it's, on the one hand, pro-privatization, and it goes against the social interest, the general interest of society. So when you're privatizing everything, you're violating the general interest of society, you're violating social progress, you're violating the social interests of the people. So in a crude way, that's what I'm talking about. I think it's antisocial because you're restricting people's abilities to get their needs met, and you're doing it on a very widespread, broad basis. I don't know if that's useful at all.
Yeah, absolutely. We've sort of talked about in the show in the past how many, just to open it up a bit, many Democratic candidates running for office are often socially progressive, but not economically. And I think that this sort of lines up with what you're talking about. In order to sort of affect real and positive change in society, you have to be thinking about how everything is intertwined with one another. You can't just be talking about fixing schools without first fixing poverty, without first fixing racism, without first fixing classism, sexism, and all other kinds of prejudice that are interwoven into the fabric of our society.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we talk about this to sort of clarify it, at least in my classes, I'll say to students, if you removed every teacher from the Rochester City School District and replaced them with 5,000 supermen and superwomen, everyone has a PhD, everyone's a super duper teacher, everyone's the top of their game, would that turn things around? Would that improve everything? And most people no, it won't. Maybe a little bit, maybe here and there, but it really won't change things because the cause of the problems experienced by so many urban school systems lies outside the school system. And even newspapers that try to speak out of both sides of their mouth have plenty of articles documenting the dire consequences of poverty and segregation and racism. But then the attitude is those problems are too big to tackle, and they can't be tackled, or they'll be tackled one day in the distant magical future that never arrives. And so what are we supposed to do in the meantime that is quote unquote practical? And practical means bringing in neoliberals and privatizers because people quote unquote want something done. And I think that's a very problematic and dangerous line. So yes, we want something done. No, we're not happy with what's going on. But again, jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire is not the way forward. And we don't want a situation where we try something horrible and then later on, oops, we didn't mean to do that, right? After all the damage has been done. So, education reform is okay, school reform is okay, but it means very little if you're not dealing seriously with the deeper, wider problems in society that are actually deepening and getting worse. So you can't have improved achievement as the social class divide in society keeps growing, as inequality and poverty keep growing. That's not how you uplift everyone.
Well, let me introduce you for the last time. We're talking with Dr. Shawgi Tell, professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College, and this is on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking about the effects of market-based reforms on public education, and we'd invite you to give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. Or at Radio EOD at our Gmail account or Facebook or Twitter to share your thoughts on the effects of market-based reforms on public education. Are you buying what we're talking about? Do you have your own theories on what should be done with the budget crisis in the RCSD or on charter schools or neoliberalism writ large? We'd love to hear from you. 585-219-8889. Perhaps we can draw some threads and larger crises in the educational system. Well, first, seems like we do have a caller. Why don't we go to the phones? Hello, you're on Evidence of Design. What's on your mind?
Hi, this is Jeff from Webster. I've been listening to the show. I just have a couple of comments for what your speaker's been indicating. Earlier he said, and I don't know what this means, you can't meet people's basic needs based on the free market. I don't know what that simplistic statement means. And then just a couple of other comments. He also indicated that education is not a commodity, it is a right. Is that actually incorporated in the New York Constitution or the U.S. Constitution? And I'm not trying to put down education, I'm just wondering if that's actually in the New York or U.S. Constitution, that education is a right. And then there was also the comment before that leaders of the world have no real solutions. I don't know what that means when the speaker said that. What problems are being referred to? And sometimes problems take incremental approaches. Like if you look at coronavirus, right now leaders of the world don't have solutions, but incrementally there will be. So I'm just posing those comments to what I was listening to, and it was confusing to me that you can't meet people's basic needs based on the free market. And is education actually a constitutional right? And it seems very simplistic to say leaders of the world have no real solutions. Thank you.
Jeff from Webster, thank you very much for your call. Dr. Tell, do you want to respond to some of those?
Yeah, so it sounds like there were several questions there, and my memory as I get older is not very good. So let me tackle the one that I remember the most, and you guys can help me remember the other one. So the issue of the right to education. So when I say education is a right, I also realize that the right to education is not enshrined in the federal constitution or any state constitution. The reason education is a right is because social consciousness and social conditions have reached a level of development where humanity automatically and just intuitively views these things as a right. So we wouldn't say to a baby, for example, you have no right to food, you have no right to water, or that these things are privileges, or these things are things you have to earn. We wouldn't say that because it's obvious to humanity that these things are needs, meaning rights. So no legal document actually enshrines education as a right. It doesn't enshrine food as a right. You have no right to food, you have no right to shelter, you have no right to education. Nonetheless, I think it's important to put forward that demand that these things are rights and should be treated as rights. You could also say healthcare should be treated as a right, even though, as far as I know, no document treats it as a right, and instead it's treated as a privilege, as an opportunity, or as something based on ability to pay. So I don't know if that clarifies it, but the other side of it was when I said that leaders are not solving anything or leaders have not offered any solutions. What I'm saying is that if you look at the last 40, 50 years, can you point to one major problem that's actually been solved by the ruling elite? Any really major problem that's actually been solved by the powers that be? And as far as I can tell, no. We see more student debt, we see more inequality, we see more environmental destruction, we see more wars and conflicts. We see the stock market going up and down like crazy, making people anxious. We see, based on different reports, we see loneliness and anxiety increasing among young people. So the list of problems is quite tragic, and none of them have really been solved. So it's in that sense that they haven't been solved. Have little things here and there been tackled and solved and approached? Yeah, probably, sure. But the big problems in terms of humanity's needs being increasingly met and humanity overall doing better, I haven't seen that. As far as people's basic needs, in the U.S. alone, you have millions of people who are either homeless or hungry or poor or illiterate. So even those basic things, yes, many are getting them because they have the money to pay for them, but millions of people's needs are going unmet. So we have millions living in poverty. Any given night, we have several 100,000 people homeless. And why is that in a society that has an overabundance of wealth? So I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, I think in that regards to your last point about can people's basic needs be met based on the free market, I've heard a lot of people argue that the only reason there is homelessness is because there's a free market, and that in the free market literally creates homelessness because of ability to pay.
So what is it? The saying is that for every one homeless person in the United States, there are 6 vacant homes. And what that proves very starkly is that things are produced for profit, not for social need. And sadly, many other examples could be given. The free market is about basically the survival of the fittest, the strongest survive, the law of the jungle, dog eat dog. And, that's great if you're very powerful and very rich, but most people are not.
Well, in our last 2 minutes, if we could perhaps keep it a little tight, Dr. Tell, you have a PhD in, I believe, the social foundations of education.
That's right.
What is that?
Yeah, it sounds esoteric and out there, and I get that question quite a bit. And even within the field, there's questions about what that means. But social foundations of education can be divided up into several concentrations: the philosophy of education, the history of education, the politics of education, and the sociology of education. And basically what the social foundations of education and its various concentrations do is look at education in deep, theoretical, analytical, philosophical ways, and not focus so much on the sort of the technicist or technical or practical side of education, as important as that is, but just go deeply into the foundations of education and the history and philosophy of education.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we're going to end our discussion here. I enjoyed the hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Tell, for being on our show.
My pleasure.
Can anyone check out your work or scholarship anywhere?
You can go to ResearchGate and just look me up, and I try to post all my materials there and keep updated there. So that's the best repository of my material there.
Wonderful. Well, if you were tuned in throughout the hour, we were Evidence of Design. I was your host, Jason Taylor, joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Good day.
and Mary Lawrence.
Have a good one.
And we were joined by Dr. Tell, who's the professor in the School of Education at Nazareth College. He's been teaching there for 21 years, and his research interests, among other things, include education policy and reform, the political economy of schooling, charter schools, and neoliberalism. You, Dr. Tell, are also a frequent contributor to the online newsletter Dissident Voice and an author of the 2016 book, Charter School Report Card. And we thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on. My pleasure.
Absolutely. We're always live on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. on 100.9 FM WXIR. And up next is the Esquire Hour. I believe they're doing a show on the Dred Scott case. Of course, I think this is the last day of Black History Month, although, of course, Black history extends far beyond the month of February and all the meanings behind it. But I believe that's where they're coming with that angle with the Dred Scott case. So stay tuned for the Esquire Hour. We appreciate you being here and staying informed to your local grassroots, community, and extreme independent radio station. Until next time, be well, be safe, stay informed, and bye-bye.